Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to the Cecil Summit. Welcome not only to those of you who are in the room, but also to our potentially worldwide audience, which includes professionals and people committed to big cat conservation around the world. Most specifically, our colleagues, and for many of us in the room, our friends who are members of the African Lion Working Group. So if technology has done its stuff, at this moment, they will be watching us from afar. Hello, African Lion Working Group. I hope you can see us all in here. And during the course of the afternoon, 4 members of that specialist group are going to be Skyping in to inform our debate. Debate. What are we doing here? Actually, those of you who are just joining us freshly now, you're joining a conversation. In a moment, I'll explain what I mean by that conversation. But first, let me explain to you, newcomers in the room, that you're joining a group of highly energized, if slightly exhausted people who've spent now nearly 3 days debating hard the plight of lion conservation around the world. Surely everybody in the room realizes that in the last 100 years or so, the number of lions in the world has plummeted from an unknown number that may have been around 200,000 to a progressively smaller and better known number, which is moving inexorably, it seems, towards closer to 20,000, maybe then a tenth the number of lions in the world in not very long. Similarly, the geographical range of lions has decreased by the better part of 90%. So we're looking at a crisis in lion conservation. And what drew us together for this Cecil Summit, as I say, it's a conversation, was the thought that the inopportune and allegedly illegal shooting of one of the WildCRU's study lions, nicknamed Cecil, grasped the world's attention. Most of you probably were aware of the torrent of media coverage. We here in the WildCRU, Oxford's Wildlife Conservation Research Unit, had some 4.5 million people visit our website in the course of the evening, the single evening when the story went viral. Of course, our website melted. Not long afterwards, Oxford University's website melted. The university found itself plunged into the greatest engagement with the local community that it's experienced in the last 1,000 years. Our partners and co-hosts of this summit at Panthera were also plunged into a torrent of interest in lions. What was to be done with that global attention to a potentially grievous crisis? One solution was to begin a conversation that doesn't culminate in, but is part of a journey that brings us to the Cecil Summit today. For the last 3 days, people who know a lot about lions and their conservation have really enjoyed and been invigorated by the company of people who profess, almost to a man or woman, to know nothing about lions and possibly, varies between them, not very much about conservation, but who know a lot about economics, about politics, about social policy, about development, about international law, even about ethics. Higher level things that may hold the secret to better enable us to promote the halt and then the reversal in these unwelcome trends in lion numbers. Now, why do I say it's a conversation? What we have not been seeking to do is, in our ivory tower, perched as angels on a pinhead, to come up with some emphatic answer that we would deliver unilaterally to the world that waits agog. Rather, what we have been doing is talking amongst ourselves about ideas that might be helpful. And ourselves includes people from the range states who actually live with lions and whose communities and nations must make policies that we hope will reverse this dreadful trend. It's a conversation because during the course of our meetings, and those of you, I hope it's all of you, who come tonight to the wider public session at 5 o'clock in the Blavatnik School, will be engaging with not only a wider public, not only the live streamed transmission of all the information that's going on there, but you will see the chief of the Africa desk of himself originally from West Africa, of UNESCO talking to us. You will hear, if the technology doesn't let us down, the Director General of Zimbabwe National Parks. You will see our effort to engage in with the people who live with lions and the peoples whose nations must decide that they wish to conserve lions. It's a conversation, and that's what will continue to evolve. You, the new members of the audience, are about to help us. After nearly 3 days, we've got quite a few ideas, but we need more. We needed more heads put to the problem. So let me tell you very briefly now some of the bullet point highlights of thoughts that have occurred to us, after which I've got 5 really significant world figures on this stage who are going to take 4 or 5 minutes each just to introduce you to how far our thinking has got by now. It's then your turn, in dialogue with them and enriched by the 4 people who will Skype into us from all over Africa, to help us refine the ideas that are taking shape, so that by the time we go to the Blavatnik School at 5 o'clock, we'll know more than we knew at 2 o'clock. Today, we know more than we knew yesterday. It's a trend we have to keep going. This is a journey. This is an unfolding summit. So at the end of today, there will be a punctuation mark on our deliberations. But everybody who's been part of this is signed up to the idea of not letting it go, not letting it slip through our fingers, of finding a way to capture this energy and drive it forward. So what are the lessons we've learned? Very briefly, I think there's some higher level thoughts that will probably come out in the conversation. One is that we may have found quite a good way of doing things. This notion of bringing together people who know a lot about one thing, not much about the rest, a lot about the rest and not much about the first, and forcing them together seems to have been a pretty productive way of doing things. Maybe we'll do it again. Another thing we've learned is, as many of us have said for 2 or 3 decades, interdisciplinarity is essential. We can't do this from silos of different subjects. We have to bring together a holistic view, and the recommendations that we're going to make embody that in a really intense way. Another thing we've learned, because we muddy-booted and sometimes bearded ecologists have been had the scales torn from our eyes by rubbing shoulders with economists and worldly people of that sort. And we've come to understand that while conservation may cost a lot of money in our meager terms, actually in terms of global budgets, it's the sort of money the world can afford and should afford. We also have the idea that perhaps as an instant output, we recommend the movement towards a catalyzing fund to come up with best common practice in lion conservation and to advance in a catalyzing way actions on the ground. So we've come up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 headings to which our panel members may loosely, but only loosely talk, and others in the audience can talk better when we start the wider discussion. More of this in more depth this evening at the public session, but just to get you on the journey, we want to restore lionscapes. We advise that the world community that wishes to see lion conservation succeed should restore lionscapes, restoring the economic and social values of lions in perpetuity. That's making sure there's enough lions. We want to consider national communities who live with lions and the nations in which those communities live, and ensure that there is both fairness in the way that lions and other wildlife are conserved, because we think of lions as a metaphor for wider wildlife, fairness between communities and conservation, and also what we could call pride in the pride, local and national pride. We think we need to investigate better the global community of interest. So just as communities and nations where lions live need to demand, to want more lions, so too the global community needs to raise its expectations for increasing lions and all that travel with them in biodiversity terms. We think that there's a number of ways of financing that. So one strand that you may hear about and develop with us this afternoon is getting the global community, essentially of the wealthy, and relative to many of the people we're talking about, everybody in this room is wealthy, but essentially getting the global community in a Robin Hood-like way to transfer funds to finance the work that needs to be done. And at an institutional level, we advise that there should be attention to the national and multinational organizations and institutions that may redirect the flow of funds, I would say rather radically, redirect thinking in the human enterprise to ensure that the environment and biodiversity and lions as an emblem and metaphor for that is properly funded within the context of development. So those newcomers to the room are our thoughts and suggestions. They're unpolished. If they're diamonds, they are only on the way to sparkling. The next 2 hours will help us get them a bit better, and that will be reflected in what we say when we reach the Blavatnik School for the wider public session. To get the debate going and to stimulate those of you who've just joined us to give us more and better ideas, I'm going to run along the table here and ask these 5 extremely distinguished speakers who have been a big part of this process to give you, for 4 or 5 minutes, no more, their thoughts. And then we'll turn to a conversation between them and you and the audience in general. Before, and Dawn, can I ask you to remind us when the first Skype call comes in, because I could easily forget. Then we'll start getting a little bit of input from the 4 people scattered in remote corners of Africa, if the technology will allow us. So, may I turn first of all to Craig Packer. Anybody who knows the world of lions knows that there are some remarkably distinguished, almost heroic, lion biologists. I don't suppose a single one of them would resent me saying that Craig is first among equals. He's the leader in this field. Craig.
Thank you, David. So just to follow on from David's remarks about the loss of lion habitat, lions were once the most widely distributed large mammal on the planet, and their numbers have shrunk quite remarkably. They are now largely restricted to the continent of Africa. Within Africa, a very substantial, if not almost 3/4 number of the remaining lions live in national parks, game reserves, other forms of protected areas where human consumption of wildlife products is not allowed, farming is not allowed. Now, if we think about the world's network of national parks and protected areas, in our own experience in the West, if we think of parks in Europe and North America, these are spots of extraordinary splendor, often of a geological nature, and they receive substantial funding, not through the fact that we pay a lot of money every time we visit the park, but from our tax dollars. So the protection of these areas is enshrined in the budgets of our national governments. In contrast, in Africa, where most of the lions still live, we have a different philosophy that these parks largely are expected to survive on the basis of entrance fees, on the basis of hunting licenses, in other words, some sort of user fees that provides enough revenue. Well, we know enough now to realize that there is a substantial shortfall in funding to provide effective management of these areas. And these areas are far more challenging to protect than are the Grand Canyon, which is just a big absence of rocks in the desert, or other geological formations in our mountainous areas in Europe. So the challenges are not just that the funds for the core protected areas are inadequate to manage them effectively, but the animals that they're meant to protect leave. They will cross the boundary of the park into surrounding communities. Elephants, lions, other species don't pay any attention to where the boundary is, and inevitably some of these species inflict profound damage. And this is profound with lions in the most existential way imaginable, in that there are occasional outbreaks of man-eating lions who may take many lives before they're finally exterminated. So we have this extraordinary contrast in our own protected areas, which are being funded, whether we go there or not, and are relatively easy to maintain compared to the most difficult kinds of conservation challenge in the poorest countries on Earth. Do not have the tax base in order to subsidize their parks like we do. And the communities that live closest to these parks are typically the poorest, the most marginalized within African nations. So this is the challenge, that species that we cherish, that we think of as iconic, as a global heritage, inflict the most significant costs on the people who can least afford them, even to the extent of their own lives.
Thank you. Although these are sort of informal presentations, I think you should be applauded. Yes, so next, I mentioned that this idea was one brought about by WildCRU together with our close partners at Panthera. And I want to say that it's both organizations welcoming you here. And in the audience, we have Luke Hunter, who's the president of Panthera, who will be also speaking this evening. We also have one of their most senior lion biologists, Paul Funston, who's now going to give his vignette of what we're up to.
Thank you. To the audience, what is the significance of 1966? It's not the fact that I was born in 1967. So what might it be? Well, from a lion, it's 50 years ago, which is one. And a couple of important things happened in 1996. Born Free, the movie, was shown for the first time. And people perhaps got to appreciate lions in ways that they had never been able to touch before. And even more importantly, and perhaps inspired perhaps by watching the earlier movie, The Serengeti Shall Not Die, George Schala arrived in the Serengeti in his Land Rover to start the first real long-term and incredibly impressive study of lions. And what George showed us in 1972, when he produced his book, which is still a must-read, and if you haven't read it, you better read it, is that lions are incredible animals, socially complex, living in large groups, able to hunt large prey, requiring large space, and doing things that are uniquely lion-like. How many lions were there around when George started his work? Well, we don't know. Tracking lion trajectories and populations over time is well nigh impossible. We often take various surveys and estimates, and we try and backtrack them and forward track them and make various projections. We don't know, but certainly there were a lot more lions around than there are today. So that's George's history. We have another person in the audience who worked up here, up in Central Africa, Hans Bauer. Hans almost tried to convince us that there was a different kind of lion out there, a lion that lives in groups of ones and twos and that lives in prides of a maximum of around about 4 individuals. And I never really believed it. But what I think he did show for us is what a disrupted population of lions looks like when we do not fund those protected areas in which lions need to exist might look like. So You all know what a rev counter looks like on a motor car or your speedometer. Essentially, this is the spine of where we envisage the lion landscapes in Africa to be. And if our engine is idling up here, we're spending less than $50, less than $100 per square kilometer per year to protect lions up in that part of Africa. And that's why there are just no lions left there. And as we come down the spine, we start to spend a little bit more money per square kilometer, and we have some lions, but they are seemingly, and not that we can count it as accurately as we would like, they are seemingly in a state of decline. And only down here, in this part of Africa, where we are spending closer to the $1,000 or $2,000 per square kilometer per year that is needed, do we have lions approaching carrying capacity and the social and functional structures that we would expect them to have. I quite often get calls from my great friend and colleague from Zambia, Matt Becker, saying, Paul, since they stopped lion hunting, we're suddenly seeing lions do this and we're seeing lions do that. And I always say to him, well, Matt, you're seeing lions do what lions do. As the population recovers and you start to see them reaching their social and ecological thresholds. So as a group, we've defined a bold initiative. We've put a term to it. We're referring to these areas as lionscapes. This is not just because we want lions out there. We want the habitat, ecosystem services, the opportunities for people to benefit for the world and local communities across these areas, which are 13 on this map. So we want you to get behind 13 lionscapes. We want investment in those lionscapes such that the lions and the human beings that use those systems benefit, and that one day, Hans goes up there to West Africa and sees groups of lions of 10 or 15 or 20 like lions should really be. That is our goal, that's our vision statement, is to secure and to restore lion populations across this, and to put our backbone onto the spinal structure up here, such that we get to a target of restoring lion populations across the geographic and genetic extent and range of the species in Africa. Thank you.
So throughout the entirety of the summit so far and the lead up to it, we've tried always to be mindful of the view of the landscape from the nation states that are fortunate still to have lions. Foremost among those is Botswana, and Professor Joseph Mweya is from Botswana University and is going, Joe, to give us his view of things.
Okay, thank you. Like I said, my name is Joseph Mweya. I come from the University of Botswana. I look back at my life in general, as far as academia is concerned. All my life has been focused on research, and this research has tended to focus on how really we can promote conservation at the same time achieve livelihoods. So to me, when it comes to the issue of conservation, there's no way in which you can separate it from livelihoods, especially if you are talking about conservation, talking about people living in those areas where you want to conserve their resources. So their livelihoods need to take precedence. One thing that is clear, that is, I think all of us, we agree on, is that lion numbers have gone down drastically in the last decades or so. And I think yesterday or day before yesterday, we talked about Tanzania and Botswana being countries where maybe some lion populations are still there. But it was interesting to learn that in Botswana, we only have about 4,000 lions. So when we look at this lion population in Tanzania, in Botswana, or East Africa, and the like. The truth about it is that they are below the carrying capacity, which means that the lions that we have are fewer than expected. And the question, therefore, is what really is causing this decline in lion population? Human activities are some of the key factors which are causing this, of which trophy hunting is one of the key factors in lion decline. In addition to that, you find that there is so much human-wildlife conflict. And when we speak of human-wildlife conflict, we are speaking of lion predation of livestock and the like. And what tends to happen is that some people simply shoot at those lions. Apart from shooting, some actually poison the lions. And if you poison a carcass and then the lions come to eat that, so what it means is that you are going to just destroy a very large number of lions. When I look at factors that are causing lion depletion in Africa or elsewhere in the world, they're not mostly biological diseases or what. They're mostly human interaction with lions. Therefore, what it means here is that our focus should look at management, policy issues. What are we doing? This therefore brings in the idea of maybe promoting collaboration. The question right now is, how are we collaborating? How much are we doing the collaboration between the scientists, us, who wants to conserve lions, and the communities who are living in those natural resource areas? How much is the interaction? And how much is the interaction, again, with governments in our countries? So what we need to look at, therefore, is that we should promote interaction between all the stakeholders. At the end of the day, we should come up with a bottom-up kind of approach in resource use, in resource management, in lion management, instead of a top-down, or coming up with a scientifically focused solution that comes from experts in universities or from international experts abroad. Those kind of approaches, to some extent, tend to have a bit of a problem. This, therefore, brings me down to the point of indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge. How much do we fuse the two together in order to achieve conservation? So there is need to recognize that local communities living in resource areas, they do have knowledge, traditional knowledge of how to conserve. You ignore it at your own peril. So what we need to do is to integrate the two, come up with a hybrid, and then with this hybrid, then we can talk of lion conservation. And my last point here is that of land use planning. The issue of conservation in Africa or elsewhere in the world also lies in what we do when it comes to issues of land use planning. When we sit down in government offices, in our areas, how do we do the planning in as far as land is concerned? And as long as we are failing to come up with appropriate and sustainable land use plans, we're going to have a challenge in as far as the lion conservation is concerned. So my take here is that much of the troubles that are befalling on the lions are mostly human-induced rather than scientific. I might be wrong, I will need to be corrected there, but what I see to be the case is that we, human beings, we are the ones who are causing a lot of lion decline. And the question, therefore, is, what is the way forward? So I think these are my reflections for now, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. So Kirk Hamilton is now a professor at the London School of Economics, but latterly he was also the economics brains behind the World Bank's environment work. And so we turn now to Kirk.
Thank you. And almost inevitably, the economist is going to talk about finance. The first draft of my title, the bullet point for this, was Financing Lion Conservation. But the more I thought about it and talked to participants and talked to Craig Packer, the better title is Fairness and the Financing of Lion Conservation. Now, from an economist's point of view, lions in the wild are what we would call a global public good. But it's much better to use plain language when we talk about these things. Lions in the wild are part of our global heritage. And in different ways, to different extents, we all benefit from having lions, whether you watch a wildlife documentary or go down the list. The fairness issue hinges on the fact that the financing for this global good is being provided by the very poorest country in the people in the world. And when we look at the costs of conservation, there's certainly the management cost. We know a lot about that. We've heard mention of the cost of predation or loss of human life. But the other issue is what we would call an opportunity cost of putting land under conservation. That land has other uses. And the predation and the opportunity cost is faced by the local community. So there's a big issue of fairness here. So any fair solution to dealing with the loss of lions and lion habitat really must somehow increase benefits for the people who are directly affected, who are the African villagers living with wildlife, in addition to the issue of financing the cost of managing wildlife protected areas. Now, among these global benefits is a very important piece, which is wildlife tourism. Some of the work I did at the bank was to try to get a handle on what is the contribution to the GDP of African countries from tourists who come to see the wildlife, or nature tourists more broadly. It's very hard to find, you can't find that number in the standard tourism statistics. You simply can't. You need to go in and specifically interview those people, the wildlife tourists, and find out what they're spending. So I did that in a couple of countries in Africa, and the numbers that come back are significant. 3 to 6% of GDP is coming directly from these tourists. And it's not just that, they're providing foreign exchange, incredibly important for African countries. So the argument I'm building up to is, viewed from this point of view, conservation in Africa is also a development issue. They are intertwined. And when we think about tapping new sources of finance, one of the things we can add to that list is, can we finance projects that are both increasing conservation and increasing development? How do we build that bridge? We probably also have to change some of the ways we do development, because some things we do in development damage wild nature. There are other sources we can go to, UN agencies, the NGO sources, high net wealth individuals, some of whom are very keen on protecting nature. But there's also, when we think about innovations in finance, we have to think about that there is this global audience out there, people who responded to the Cecil moment, who in one way or another benefit from having lions, who care about lions in the wild. And one of the things we need to do is find ways to reach out to them. And even if it's a small contribution, we're talking about millions and millions of people, right? So even if it's a small contribution, how do we get them involved in helping to solve this problem? So we go beyond the usual suspects. One of the things, and we'll hear various aspects of this in the discussion, we need to reach out to that global audience. And one of the reasons they will want to do that is because it's not about just lions. Today, they want their children to see lions. Right? Thank you.
Well, Hakim Steiner at the end of the table is looking remarkably alert for a man who was generous enough to shorten his time at the IUCN conference in Hawaii in order to fly back to be with us today. And we're grateful for you battling jet lag as you doubtless are. Hakim was, until quite recently, the Director General of UNEP. He was, as from this morning, the head of the Marcy School where we're sitting today. So he brings a diversity of experiences to his vignette of where we are.
Thank you, David. And in some ways, it's very easy to follow this panel because actually from right to left, it was the narrative of what I think the conversation at this summit is about. It is facing the fact that lion numbers have gone through a drastic decline. And we are not only confronted with the fact that they are disappearing in entire parts of the world and increasing on the continent. I think your term of the spine of trying to now address lion conservation with those areas where lions are still found today is critical to begin to stem this bleeding. And I think it is a departure point from where we can begin to stop the decline. But at the end of the day, the last two presentations spoke to the fact that it's not just about stopping the decline, because 20,000 is a frighteningly low number. And it echoes, sadly, to a finding, again, of the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species that was issued this week, which replicates this narrative and story, unfortunately, across so many other species that are either already faced with extinction or certainly very threatened. I do believe that in both the last presentations lies a fundamental truth. Lion conservation is not in the first instance a biological, ecological challenge. Because the threat, as we also heard from many reports, most recently again from the University of Queensland that analyzed the Red List of Threatened Species, the principal factor that is threatening wildlife in its immediate sense is we, humans. But this is not a crime in the first instance, because why do we do this? Because we want to live, we want to grow food, we want to send our children to school, we want to try and survive. So the frontier between wildlife in an ecological habitat sense and humans in their economic habitat is the front line of where lion conservation and conservation in general needs to define its points of intervention. And I think we, as Kirk pointed out just now, and also Joe, there are two dimensions to this. One is the macro perspective. Why should a nation care about keeping lions within its territory? It takes up a lot of land, it kills cattle, it kills people. It's a liability on many fronts that those who sit, at the end of a television set watching Discovery and National Geographic have no sense. They don't bear any burden. And therefore, this notion of where do you actually begin to address the rationale for wanting to keep lions? Because for some, it's actually, a blessing to finally get rid of this threatening animal. And one level has to be the national level. And it is in many ways a narrative around the economic benefits, not just in purely financial terms. And I think this is one of our challenges and why our work is so important in an interdisciplinary, in a joined up sense now, because we can, I am convinced, we can create for a Minister of Finance a very clear rationale. If you have tourism, even better, because tourism is a lot of money. For a lion that costs a local farmer in Botswana, there is another person living in the United States willing to pay $500, $1,000, $1,500, some even $2,000 for a night to sit next to that lion. Now you can connect these two realities and you begin to have one source of economic benefit. But it's not only that. I pointed in an earlier presentation to the employment economy, which has so many other benefits. You can send your children to school. Children will live or not die as early, will be able to go to school, have better incomes in the future and income streams. You can look at the carbon sink function, often associated with national parks. Many of the most effective carbon sinks in the world are today located within forest or more broadly protected areas. How can you, in an economy that is increasingly going to battle with climate change, bring these two worlds together? So these are just a few examples of the macro rationale on which WildCRU for so many years have led fascinating work. I think we need to give this far greater exposure, because it cannot just be the economists and the, let's say, conservationist passion. It needs to become a national budget and investment discussion in countries. The other part is at the local level. I think, why should a community, a family, a head of household in a village in Zimbabwe, in Kenya, in Botswana, care about lion conservation? And I think this notion that people in principle do not care about wildlife and lions is a complete misinterpretation. I think we need to also work very much at this hybrid logic, I think, Joe, that you pointed to, because we have quite a lot of instances today, whether it is conservancies in Namibia, whether it is the campfire experience in Zimbabwe, community-based natural resource management, the benefits around also, for instance, in Kenya, where communities derive direct and tangible benefits. We can construct a logic that is not just abstract in terms of appealing to people, but that makes lions part of a broader conservation-led, or at least coexisting economy. And this is not impossible. We have proof of that. The problem is it has remained in the realm of pilot projects. It has remained also in the domain of those who care about lions because they care about lions, rather than those who say, look, lions are a part of our ecology, but also of our economy, and therefore of our culture, of our history, and of our future. And that's why I think the summit, David, and I congratulate you again for bringing together a broader group, because it is in reframing the challenge of lion conservation, which in turn, as you pointed out, speaks to the broader challenge of habitat, which in turn addresses the relation between people and wildlife, that I think we are going to have to, and hopefully we'll see many of the breakthroughs in the years to come. And let me end with one example that I recently, had the opportunity to see firsthand, which challenges also a whole paradigm of conservation that is changing and evolving, but has taken perhaps a little bit too long. And that was around the Virunga National Park. I visited Virunga a few months ago, and if there is ever a setting in which conservation is almost an impossible dream, it is in that part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Insecure, years of war, people desperate, an almost complete absence of government services. And it is from that national park, and with a team of national park officials led by a gentleman called Emmanuel de Merode, there is a story that was told there that was fascinating. Emmanuel basically, in a very brief 30-second summary, said, when we arrived, we basically were told it is insecurity in the charcoal trade that is threatening the mountain gorilla. So the first thing we started doing is to try and stop the charcoal trade, which literally within about 4 to 5 months turned the entire region against the national park and everything that park was trying to do. And the story of Emmanuel and his team in rethinking how you turn the whole logic upside down and begin to make the park work for the people so that people begin to believe in the park is a story every one of us should have a look at, because if it can be done there, it can be done elsewhere. And I kid you not, there is now a micro hydropower station being built there that will provide the only source of electric power in the region. There's a business school together with Stanford being built in the middle of the forest, twice abandoned the building site because of bullets flying, to help local businesses to be set up, and water supplies from the park, etc., etc. If there is one reason that mountain gorillas will survive in that part that is shared by Rwanda, DRC, and Uganda, then it is because people suddenly see that this is actually their best hope of getting a benefit for them in the absence of governments being able to provide them. So this is not theory we're talking about. It is just not being accepted because it's more complex, it's more challenging, it's more difficult, but it is, in my mind, the shortcut, if you want, to stemming the loss of lions, of wildlife, of habitat, and a very disturbed relationship between people and wildlife. Thank you.
Marvellous. Well, now, those of you who have just joined us have the opportunity to put questions to the panel, to raise issues that other people in the room could answer, and most particularly to contribute to our attempt to identify innovative ways of doing lion conservation. It's a metaphor for the rest of conservation better. Those of you who've been with us for the last couple of days have a chance to further refine your ideas. So please, the floor is open. Yes.
I think it's a very simple question. How much is it going to cost? This is perhaps a question for the economist, but in German.
It's actually the conservation specialists who've been struggling with that number, so I can...
but even as a ballpark figure, I mean, one of the presentations said that at the moment it's varying, people spending $50 a year per kilometre to $1,500, did you say? So what just as a rough figure, what are we looking for?
The scale of the problem is we've been considering it, it's about $2 billion a year. And that's every year.
For a sustainable...
For a sustainable management of these wildlife areas, yeah.
Hello. I'm sure this was discussed earlier, but as Craig Packer said, this was once the most widely distributed vertebrate globally. All the discussion so far has been about conserving lions within their existing range, but presumably parts of the former range are places where the economic drivers are different and where you might be getting closer to people who have relatively more money to spend on something. So is that something that you're ruling out of discussion here? Or is that another strand of the discussion that's gone on the last few days? So thinking about lions in other lion landscapes elsewhere in the world.
Not ruling anything out of the discussion. So would anybody like to pick that up? Paul?
I think in a lot of the existing or the surviving lion areas, the populations are well below their carrying capacity. And I think a lot of the discussions people are having is, would the proposed mitigation practices or improved management techniques bring the populations up to their full potential? And that could overall have a substantial effect, potentially maybe even doubling what's left in that map that Paul showed earlier in those green areas. But there's also lions outside of those areas, so there's a number of people interested in trying to maintain or restore connectivity between some of these, within the archipelago of some of these sites. We've had some people here who've argued for restoration of lions back to North America and Europe, and I'm not sure if that stuck very tightly to people's shoes or not. But really it's within Africa.
Christos. Oh, then we'll come back to you. What do you want to go?
On that point.
Okay, well, Christos, just pause, please.
One of the things I learned at this discussion was that, in fact, in Africa, there's a lot of wildlife, including lions, outside of protected areas. And in some ways, some of what I've seen happening in Kenya suggests that may be an opportunity as well, because we're seeing these community conservancies springing up indigenously. It's not a donor coming in and suggesting this is a great idea and giving money. It's coming from the community, which means it's likely to be sustainable. They may need some expertise to help with it, but it may be sustainable. And what they need is a right to use the land, so the government has to provide that. It's not an easy question. But with that, then they can bring in an investor to put in a safari camp or something like that. So it's not just the lions in the parks. It's one of the lessons I took away.
Christos.
Well, thank you very much. In a way, we're teaching to the converted everybody in this room, right? And we mentioned that one of the goals is to persuade, let's say, ministers in the countries of the lion ranges to believe in including the lion conservation within the national budget, the cost and opportunity cost and everything. Now, are there lessons that we can learn from the countries where they lost the lions, whether it's like Iran, where they lost maybe 100 years ago, or some West African countries, of what is the damage that was done in their economies, from having lost the lions, and bring them on board to help persuade the other people? Because I need to be persuaded, and I'm a conservationist, whether really their money lost, to the individual Kenyan, to the individual Tanzanian from losing the lions. Are there any studies that have looked at that?
Well, I can't point you at a study, I'm afraid. There may be examples I don't know. But I started my conversation with this group by saying, one of the things we can think about in arguing with the finance minister is, once we have a better picture of what is the contribution of the nature tourist to GDP, it's substantial. We can provide credible numbers. Some of the things I was doing at the bank, we're leading in that direction. Then you can say, what's the value at risk? You can start asking people, not just, you enjoyed your safari, will you come back to this country? You can then do a scenario that says, well, let's imagine something terrible happens. You lose the lions in this country, whether it's poaching or bush meat or whatever, right? Think about your answer again. How likely are you to come back? So you can get a very crude measure of value at risk there. And you can go to the finance minister and say, you may not appreciate, first of all, how much the tourist is contributing to your economy, but you also don't appreciate how much of that you lose if you lose the lions. So there's ideas out there. They haven't been tried. They sound like ideas that are worth trying.
Nobby, but can you do something within 2 minutes? Because then the call from South Africa will come.
Concerning what Ben asked and Craig answered, of course, lion range state and outside, lion has been all over the world. And I have been involved in potential financial issue between Middle East and India, because those Middle East has been inhabited by Indian lions and similar phytogeny. So yes, there are several other scopes in Siberia, Middle East. However, that is, I think, beyond the scope of this meeting.
So, Akim,
you're
please
setting
make a
up.
start. We'll maybe be interrupted by Skype.
Very briefly, I think this issue on the cost, if you look at it in pure number terms, it depends on who you are and what you're looking at. Our $1 trillion economy, 2 to 3 billion, and however one arrives at that figure, is not that much. An oil company today has a net profit between 20 to 40 billion a year. So let's put it in perspective. The second thing is we are already investing quite a bit. Maybe we need to look more at the rates of return on investments. Every national park service, every government is investing. And finally, I think we also need to look at the fact that let's not isolate the lion from the larger wildlife, from the larger ecosystem, from the larger local economy, because it is in the combination. This is where economists also need to, I think, help the conservation community more to begin to think in systems. Because if you take a systems approach to rationalizing, allocating this land for that purpose versus this purpose, you will more likely arrive at a conservation-led land use management option than if you try to isolate one species. And that's why lions need particular attention, need particular intervention right now, but they need to be looked at as part of a broader conservation economy in the national and global economic context.
Excellent. So now we're going to try and get a view from Matt Becker, very notable lion biologist who's going to talk to us from Osaka. He's worked really practice.
You need such a
huge.
huge.
We get a Zambian view. Can we turn his volume up a bit?
try one more time?
Can everyone hear me? Okay?
Yeah, that's fantastic.
That's it?
Yeah.
Okay.
It took the head of the marketing school to work it out, but there you are. Great. So just to explain, everybody can see your face. I believe you can you see some of the audience?
Yeah, I've got about 5 different note screens up here, so not sure which one's the real time, but I can see, yes.
Okay, wonderful. So I think David's going to invite you
your
to...
5-minute perspective from Zambia, Matt. Over to you.
Okay. Well, firstly, I just wanted to thank WildCRU and Panthera for the opportunity to speak at this really important summit, and really appreciate it, and hopefully we can provide a good perspective from Zambia on lion conservation. And frankly, I don't have a whole lot more articulate and intelligent to say than what was just said by the panel. I think there's virtually everything we would agree on from our side. Just as a background, the Zambian Carnivore Program is a nonprofit working in collaboration with the Department of National Parks and Wildlife here in Zambia. And we work across 3 ecosystems, 2 of which are the largest populations of lions in the country. And that is the Luangwa Valley and the Greater Kafue ecosystem, which is a project we continued from Panthera work initiated several years ago, and then a recovering lion population on the border of Angola, the Luba Plain, which has probably the most famous living lion now, Lady Lua. But anyway, it strikes me also in listening to everyone about the diversity of problems, how there's such a complexity for each ecosystem depending on, you know, the lion population, the ecosystem, the cultures, the communities around it. And so that really makes certain prescriptions difficult to be blanket. But I think overall the ecosystems in Zambia where lions reside are characterized by large landscapes, and those are typically protected area complexes that have national parks surrounded by game management areas. And these national parks are strictly protected, and then game management areas, there are people living there, and consumptive uses of wildlife and natural resources are permitted, including trophy hunting of lions and their prey and other animals. And so I just wanted to put a couple bullet points to the perspective on Zambian lions in no particular order, but I think if there was one, conservation of large landscapes is our #1 priority, I think, for lion conservation. I think Paul demonstrated that very well with the lionscapes. Zambia has a lot of area for wildlife at present, and it borders 8 countries. Almost 40% of the land is managed for wildlife and wildlife-based economies. There's a lot of potential there, and as human pressures increase, we really need to sort of batten down on protecting the connectivity between these areas and the populations remaining in them. And similar to what everybody else has been saying, we need to have a very integrated approach. And I would also add to that, from the Zambian perspective, I think we need to have all the tools in the toolbox. I guess that would be my second bullet point. And that, what I mean by that is, currently, and you know, in large part, the impetus for this summit, there's a lot of controversy, and I don't think you meet too many people who don't have an opinion on lion trophy hunting, whether it's pro or con. And I think the point is that lion trophy hunting, if done sustainably, has benefits for lion populations and lion habitat. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do, is to conserve populations and habitats. And so we need to recognize that there are bigger threats on the horizon than the 2 different types of lion hunting and lion tourism. And of course, that means it needs to be sustainable, and that's another priority. But I think given the size of these areas that we're looking at, conserving large landscapes, we need to have an array of land uses and wildlife uses. And in concert, they are much more effective at conserving things than the alternatives, which are often poaching, agriculture, encroachment, all of those things. And so also we need to recognize that mortality of lions in hunting or snaring or conflict, they don't act independently. And so any sort of conservation initiative needs to collectively address that. And so that boils down to stewardship of these areas. And I think sort of in closing, two other points that would be important in our perspective is that I really like the idea of trying to integrate development planning and conservation. They do not need to be in opposition. In fact, the amount of money going into development and what we're trying to do with conservation, I think there are some amazingly innovative and potentially successful big ideas that we've just heard that could be very effective. And my last point is, integrating the human aspect of conservation. We obviously need to focus heavily on making sure that there are benefits accrued from wildlife to local communities. But one thing we probably neglect is the development of local leaders. And that means finding people that are really passionate about conservation of lions and wildlife in the same way that everyone in this room is. And they're out there in all the lion populations, and we need to really find them, help support them, and help them fulfill their potential as local leaders in wildlife conservation in general and lion conservation in particular. Thank you.
So Matt, I hope you could hear the warmth of that applause. Thank you very much for your injection of fresh thoughts into our discussions. We're going to say farewell now while we try and Skype to somebody else, but hopefully you can continue to follow us through the live streaming. So Matt, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. We're now trying to reach Zimbabwe.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very good. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you doing, Don?
Very well. So, Godfrey, you are live in the Oxford Martin School. You're on the big screen. I think you can see the audience from your side. So, David's going to invite you to talk to everybody in the room.
Yeah. So, Godfrey, I know you've been part of this meeting as it's unfolded from afar. We had hoped you would be with us, but the visas didn't go our way. So now, Godfrey, we have a room of people continuing the debate and looking forward to a Zimbabwean perspective for about 5 minutes from you.
Okay. Thank you so much, David, and a good afternoon to everybody in the summit. It's a pleasure, actually, for me being here back again today, just to further share with you my perspectives, especially from the Zimbabwean side, just as David has just said. First and foremost, I think for us to be able to achieve success in terms of lion conservation, we have to invest more into, first of all, the areas in which we are finding these lions in abundance. And then when we identify, of course, we already know some of those areas. When you know those areas, you then have to move a step up, for instance, to look at connectivity. Like I said before, that the success of the future of these lions, it lies in the transfrontier conservation areas, of which Kaza, TFC, the Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area is one of them. And CASA TFCA is Conservation, Tourism, and Sustainable Development Program of the 5 governments of Angola, Botswana, Namibia, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And it's a baby of SADC, of course. So, as part of its aims or objectives or goals for its establishment, it also took into consideration some of the things, such as trying to create some linkages or connectivity in terms of some protected area networks that might be in the CASA landscape. Of course, some of the areas or habitats which are very, very suitable, but which might not be formally protected per se. So it's one of the main areas which I think a lot of us or conservationists should focus on, trying to enhance or rather nourish some of these initiatives or ideas such as transfrontier conservation areas. I think not much attention as they deserve, that's my feeling, has been given to, or support has been given to these transfrontier conservation areas. Yes, we've had some of the organizations such as Peace Parks Foundation and also CASA, specifically KfW, which is a German development bank. They've been playing their part in terms of facilitated development of the CASA TFCA or these TFCAs, but I still feel that a lot of other organizations or initiatives or institutions not come to the party as yet. Just imagine an alliance which will be involving, for instance, WildCRU, Panthera, and the CCI, the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, which is also in Cambridge, which is not very far from where you are. Imagine with the potential that I think you guys have, if you form some alliances and then you say you want to come and do some work collectively with people on the ground, I definitely think we will win the battle, because this is what we are all looking forward to, those initiatives, so that we ensure that we would have secured the connectivity of the protected area networks, or even some of the other habitats in which these animals like to roam. And just for maybe the benefit of the house, this CASA TFCA that I'm talking about, it is actually where Sisu the lion used to roam. That was in Wange National Park. And I think I should not also go without saying I'm actually very, very much impressed just with the idea of holding this summit, because this has been something that I've been really, really looking forward to, and quite anticipating that one of the days something like this will come for us, or be able to participate, so that at least to bring, I can say, some think tanks like those who are in that room, maybe those who have been participating in this summit, even it has been remotely from wherever we have been. But I just feel that it has been like, a quantum leap, actually. Because, first of all, this will provide a platform whereby we'll be able to come together, sit down, we discuss, we share ideas, we exchange notes. It's almost like sort of like a friendly, not emotionally charged kind of setup, like a time that usually happens when there are some certain maybe problems or challenges, and people try to meet, sit down and talk. It's usually difficult, to open an ear at it. But just to round up from what I also feel, I think this is what has come out of this summit as well, to say we really need to make sure that the communities that are living with the lions, they really feel that these lions have got an economic or even a social benefit to them, so that they are quite like motivated to take care of those animals, knowing that at least they are also going to provide some sort of livelihood to them. And also to ensure that wildlife department and the researchers who are there on the ground looking for some answers, some solutions for so whoever other stakeholders that might be part and parcel of the solution. These guys, they really need our support, or we really need your support. Anyway, mind you, I'm coming also from a background of a researcher and also working for the Wildlife Authority, and also privileged to be working on a regional initiative like the TFCA. So I think I might be running out of time because, of course, there's always a lot to share. But those are some of my feelings and my thoughts. And remember, I told you that the key, it lies definitely with the traditional leaders. So let's make sure that when we get onto the ground, we want to try and do or implement some certain conservation efforts or projects. Let's make sure that these communities in which we're going to operate in, they really benefit. Remember, I spoke about trying to repackage and also refocus our strategies on how we've been doing things. I think if we also focus in terms of trying to ensure that these traditional leaders, we get their buy-in, and consequently we win the hearts of the local communities that they'll be operating in. This will take us far, and I'm sure we'll be able to actually achieve or attain some of these conservation goals in terms of, for a particular case of conserving the African lion, which I think is really, really difficult. But mind you, we're talking about the African lion, which I think it also requires a lot more of an African approach to it, because it's, as Africa, there is a lot of emphasis to do with culture. So that's why I've also spoken about the traditional leaders, because when you talk about culture in African settings, traditional leaders, chiefs, they become the right answer or the right point or pressure point which we can actually utilize. So I would like to say, in a nutshell, please just work on forming some of those alliances or partnerships or collaborations that you can. The example that I gave for WildCRU, Panthera, and also Cambridge Conservation Initiative, it was simply because I know that the other ones might be good in maybe science, conservation science, and then the other ones might also be good maybe in terms of some socioeconomic aspects, and then both of you or both sides might be strong in terms of policy. So if you bring your heads together, I am sure that to fit this jigsaw puzzle, which appears quite complicated, but from how I see it, if we come together, we should be able to win and come up with some potential and practical solutions to conserving African lions. I thank you.
Godfrey, thank you so much. And we've succeeded over the technology again. We'll wish you farewell now and continue our discussions here. We'll be in touch, Godfrey. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm off the hook. Cheers.
David, should I try Colleen, or do you want to have a space?
No, I think we have a space now, if we can. So there's an opportunity to continue our discussion, I think, in the room, thinking of the Zambian perspective. Peter, I know you always have a broad perspective there. People who are working in the Kaza landscape may want to comment, but Christos first.
Just anonymous from the microphone. I have not been part of the last 2 days of discussion that happened. Maybe it's been discussed. What is the conservation
to give it a stab. We debated what our target might be. Some of us felt that we should double the number of lions, or we should set a target of 50,000 by some point in time. Others felt that people might not want to hear, governments might not want to hear that we want suddenly a whole lot more lions. But they might want to hear that we would like more lions to contribute to socioeconomic development in their regions. And so that sort of argument is really what we've got to. From a marketing perspective, if we're going to go and source funding and if we're going to reach out to the global community, maybe a target will be very useful there. Actually, something for us to aspire towards and something to sort of get traction behind. I think, I don't think that sovereign states play games like this with lions, like you're suggesting might happen. And I think in many cases, the leaders of these countries are not aware that the populations have perhaps declined as much as they have in their particular countries, and are generally and genuinely concerned and interested once they hear this information. So I do think that there is a perhaps global consciousness around lions with respect to African leaders, both at the government and at the traditional level.
Good. A very quick point. I mean, from an economist's perspective, having governments competing to provide more lions strikes me as a rather good thing.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point to those of you who are new here, that Africa has set aside a massive protected area network. We estimate about 1.2 million square k's of protected areas in lion range, which is actually more than enough to achieve effective conservation of the species. And if that area was properly secured and had the resources required to manage it properly, we could probably have somewhere between 3 and 4 times the number of lions that we currently have, not including the areas outside of protected areas. And as was alluded to earlier, there's really exciting initiatives on community lands as well. Now, in terms of the distribution of lions, so we're finding that lions and other wildlife species are increasingly becoming restricted to a handful of the better known southern and eastern African countries. So the fear is that a number of countries are going to start losing their wildlife resources before they ever really have a chance to benefit from them. And so I think it would be a tragedy if that was allowed to happen. So we need to try and make sure that countries in West and Central Africa, as well as the important southern and eastern African countries, retain their wildlife endowments.
Thank you. Well, I'm curious on the figure that were shown on the map. We have identified about 13 possible lion landscapes for possible conservation. And I'm curious, I want to know more whether these possible conservation landscapes, they cover the open areas or is only protected areas. And as our experts, I would like to know what are the possible long-term strategies that you have in place so that we don't lose most of our lion populations in the coming years. Thank you.
Okay, so definitely the lionscapes include matrices of protected areas, networks, so where generally there's strict protection without any form of consumptive use, and communal lands, if you want to call it that sort of general term. I cannot think of a single area in Africa where lions, for example, don't only occur in a communal land area, but there isn't a protected area somewhere part of the matrix in that particular site. So the lionscapes are basically chosen in terms of the fact that this is where lions currently exist. These are where the biggest protected areas are across the species range. So many of them are small towards the western side of our spine, but those are the spots where they do continue to exist in those regions. In terms of strategies, there are a number of them. Key and probably foremost, perhaps from the sort of lion perspective, is that the security, the site security within the law enforcement within the protected areas needs to be improved in most cases. So because governments do not invest as much money as they might like to in those areas, the extraction of resources from the systems results in the decline of lions. Then one sort of moves to the edges of protected areas where security is often an issue, but also conflict with community starts to come at play. And so obviously resolving and targeting hotspots of conflict, especially where conflict abuts against really key components or parts of the landscape, is obviously very important. And then moving out into the communal lands, Joe, what do you think? What do we do outside of these protected areas?
Yes, I was going to say, you take the case of Botswana. You'll find that only 17% of the land is national parks and game reserve. And then you have another 22%, which is communal areas where there's a lot of wildlife, including lions. So in reality here we are talking about close to 40% of Botswana's land. There is a lot of wildlife in there, including lions. So coming to really the management of lions in these areas, be they protected areas, they're a bit safe. But outside the protected areas, that is the 22%, that's where we have a lot of challenges, in the sense that that's where you'll find a lot of communities in there. That's where you'll find a lot of human-wildlife conflicts, predation, and the like. Already people suggested an integrated approach, really, in managing resources in these areas, which I think I do agree with that. We shouldn't look at one aspect, we should look at it in a holistic manner. In so doing, I think we will go far. Thank you.
Very briefly, I think the point of what happens outside protected areas is important in two respects. One, again, in the short term, protected areas are, let's say, last resort, but also reservoir for recovering lion populations beyond protected areas. The Botswana example being an excellent one, because conservation is viable well beyond protected areas in the current land use regime. But also, if you take Kenya, for instance, interesting developments just in the last few years with conservancies being, in a sense, triggered by a tourism opportunity linked with conservation, where Maasai communities that are, in some instances, the Naivasha Conservancy, for instance, I know a little bit better, 500 families own land. It is parceled, but managed virtually. If it had not been for tourism, if it had not been for the Conservancy negotiating a long-term lease, which involved a lot of work in getting all these members of the community to agree, they now have a dividend flow that is literally monthly providing them an income, with an agreement to withdraw their cattle under certain times of the year, etc. You have an entirely different conservation management or conservation-led management use scheme in place, but the community is actually better off than before. Wildlife is better off than before, and alternative income streams have been created. It is not magic. It is just, learning lessons and designing strategies well beyond the protected areas estate, and yet the two depend on one another a lot.
So I suggest what we do is hold that thought in mind, and perhaps after our next and final two Skype interventions, we might turn to John Kamanga, who represents the Maasai community in southern Kenya, Guy Weston also working in that community. But let's see now if we can get Colleen Begg, who's in Mozambique. This is our most ambitious attempt for the afternoon. Yeah, it worked earlier at practice. There we are.
Hello. Hi.
Oh, Colleen, that's wonderful. Wonderful. We can't see you, but we can hear you perfectly. The room is looking forward to your perspective from Niassa and from Mozambique. And everybody realizes they're about to hear from Colleen Begg, who almost single-handedly has raised the world's profile in Niassa as a sort of model attempt to conserve lions. Colleen, over to you for, please, no more than 5 minutes.
Thanks, David, and I hope this works. I'm sitting in the Niassa Reserve, and it's wonderful to be with you all. I'm hoping that everyone will tell me if this doesn't work. And so my I was asked by David to provide the sort of top 3 priorities that I think are important for lion conservation. And I think the first thing is that we need to lose our ego and we need to collaborate more. I've become increasingly frustrated in the last few weeks when the elephant census results came out. And we've also heard about what's happening with pangolin, what's happening with wild dogs and all these species. And we need to actually work together and not be so speciesist. I think there is a lot of money out there that we are wasting by our need for credit and our need to be able to work on our own species. And there are a lot of people in the same places doing conservation work, tackling the same threats, and we should be collaborating. The second thing that I think from years of experience in NIASA is that we need to have development for communities. And I'm not talking about engagement, and I'm not talking about building a clinic or a school. We need to provide them with cash so that they can increase their livelihoods and their well-being. And that can either be through employment or developing alternative livelihoods or performance payments. But I think that a lot of our community programs are really paternalistic. And we need to get away from that and let communities decide for themselves how they want to live their lives. And so they are able to get out of poverty, because lions are living with some of the poorest communities in Africa. And I know here we have 40,000 people living with 800 to 1,000 lions. And the thing that has made the most difference are alternative livelihoods programs that provide people with an alternative income. We don't need people to like lions. And really, this is not about lions. This whole tragic situation that we're in is about people. And then, of course, everyone's going to say, well, how do we find the money? And I think that it has to become a global responsibility to provide these funds. I don't believe that ecotourism or sport hunting can do this. So I think that we need to decide, do we want these animals out there, whether they be lions or elephants? And then conservation philanthropy is going to have to pay for anti-poaching and for community engagement. And I know that many in the audience will say, well, that's not sustainable. Well, actually, I think it is. Because there's no doubt that we all care about these animals and we're going to care about them for the rest of our lives. So we need to pay for it. I'm tired of wildlife having to pay for itself. I don't think it works. So this whole phrase, if it pays, it stays, is basically, if we pay for it, it will stay. And I also think we need to go back to the basics and work with these communities on the ground through these grassroots programs. We don't need highly technical programs. We don't need more militarization. We need long-term programs that develop trust and treat people with respect. And a huge amount can be done by having people on the ground that are sitting under mango trees, having conversations and developing alternative ways to do things. I'm appalled by the way all of us in the conservation community have wasted huge amounts of money. And I think that was less than 5 minutes, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Colleen, that was beautifully clear, and your points came over with great impact. So what we're going to do now is thank you. We'll be in touch in the coming days, but the conversation will continue here, enriched by your remarks, which were extremely perceptive. Thank you so much, Colleen. We'll say bye-bye for now.
Thank you.
Very good. Okay, so before we heard those remarks, we were thinking about talking about lions beyond protected areas. John and Guy may have something to say, but when Colleen raises the point, we discussed it much, about whether wildlife can or should be asked to pay for itself. I don't know, Craig, maybe I could come back to you because you speak very clearly on that one. John, would you like to make a brief point?
I think the question of conservation and engaging communities. In Kenya, we gave an example that today we have about 10% of the Kenya space that is under conservation, that is put in by communities against 8%, which is what the protected areas have. So therefore, communities have now put in a bigger space towards conservation than what we have as a state to control, under our control for wildlife conservation. But the movement for me was very simple. I think about 15 years ago, Kenya started on the movement of parks beyond parks. So therefore there was an express interest to actually get out there and ensure that we bring communities closer so that we can conserve the spaces, we can conserve wildlife together with communities out there. And a little bit of investment came in, I think, from the EU, where there was, again, a process of ensuring that there was a little bit of seed fund that allowed communities that were going out there to do conservation, support them. And it's only until 2 years ago that Kenya has actually legislated conservation outside national parks. But we see that within that period, when just the announcement and the goodwill was there from the government, the process started. And today, Kenya is talking of about 150 community conservancies within a span of 1 decade. And that can only increase if we continue to incentivize communities to want to live with wildlife and stop bringing the red tapes that then take us back in time. I think what she said, the presenter before me, the question of respect. If we only respect communities, understand conservation from their standpoint, I think we will actually go a long way. It looks like from these deliberations, both the communities living with wildlife will want still to continue to live with wildlife. The friends who are not in wildlife areas want to go and see wildlife. I think for us, it's a question of how do we bring these two together so that then we can continue to resource and bring the knowledge required today, because of course, things have changed. Things are not the way they were. Population is growing, we are told. So therefore, the need for livelihood sources beyond the traditional livelihood has continued to grow. And therefore, we will need to change the dynamic on the ground so that people can still continue to get maximum benefits out of their resources without necessarily encroaching too much into the spaces. Thank you.
So I lost track of time for a moment, so before we turn to Guy and Craig, we should quickly try now and get Sam Ferreira, who's going to talk to us, I hope, from Skukuza in South Africa.
Let's hope he doesn't go radical.
Hello, Sam?
Yes, Clement, I can hear you.
Oh, very good, Sam. So at the moment we can't see your picture, which we did earlier, but we can hear your voice clearly. So the gathering in the room is very much looking forward to getting a 4, maximum 5-minute perspective. Oh, now we can see you. All is well.
Yeah, I managed to solve technology this side.
Very good. Okay, Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everybody. There's many friends there that I heard and saw. It's lovely to have an opportunity. I'm Sam Ferreira. I'm based in Kruger National Park, and have the responsibility for 5 or 6 national parks that do contain lions. 2 of those are relatively large, and the other ones are small ones which are probably a big exception compared to the rest of Africa, where we got very hard fences that separate lions from surrounding landscapes. But that just gives you the context. When David asked me to talk about it, he didn't give me nice instructions like he gave Colleen. So I sort of asked myself, I wonder what I should think a little bit about. And the very first question I wanted to ask was, well, why should lions matter? And we've heard a number of the speakers and the comments in this discussion already. We can make ecological arguments, and we can make economic arguments, and we can make social arguments. I think Kirk actually summarized some of those various values as well. But what is very evident, a common theme in the discussion, which I've been following here on the live stream, is two things. We largely think that money is short, and we largely think that a species must pay to stay, except for Colleen. And I think one of our key challenges may come a little bit about how we think about our problem. So if we think about what's a primary challenge for lions, that's a normal place that we start. They sort of bounce into two groups, usually associated with ecological things that we worry about. It's habitat encroachment or destruction, fragmentation, associated diseases. And then the other one is an economical one, things around bush trade, bushmeat trade, poaching and associated poisoning. The reality is that all of these actually associate commonly with what humans are doing, and I think Joseph highlighted very nicely. So when we think about these things, our debate is largely about how many lions do we need. We had a nice comment there from Paul. And then we debate that because I think Peter Lindsay highlighted that, yes, protected areas have got challenges. And often in many cases, they may not be large enough, but even if they are large enough, we're not governing them very well. And so in the end, we actually debate a hell of a lot about how do we get funds. And most of our ideas about getting funding is actually external. It's often related to about pumping funding into a particular area. So those are the kind of challenges. But I think Godfrey and I think Matt also highlighted some important things. It started with David's point of landscapes of lions. The bottom line is that we're actually going to need lions and people to coexist, much like what Paul, I think, described. And our traditional way has been, let's separate lions and people. Well, we try anyway. And if we can't do that, we pay them compensation. And very often our compensation is actually a compensation payment for an asset that we've lost. How the hell can you compensate for the loss of a lion? So we're not even doing our compensation that is directed at re-establishing relationships with people that has had a bad deal with lions around. The one other thing that I think we don't often think a little bit about, and that is coexistence also can happen on a temporal scale. And maybe there's a gap that one can think about. So let me go on to what I think is actually what I've described now is largely ways that we respond to the symptoms associated with lions. But if we think a little bit about what the causes are of these challenges, I think most of it comes from our past. We move people out of places to create protected areas. So it's really the conservation elite that actually removed the rights of people. And that ends up with a whole bunch of things. It's primarily 6 activities or 6 drivers that really create illegal activities, and then most of them associated with economic reasons. So the economists will be happy that I'm talking. And our response is, we often talk about distant problems. For example, when we talk about poaching, we talk about lots of people wanting to have a commodity somewhere away, very far away from where we're living. There's high profit potential in that commodity. That's why crime and all these things get involved. And yes, people have got long traditions of trade. But perhaps we need to look closer to home. When David talked a bit earlier about the meltdown of the WildCRU's website, I wondered how many Africans living next to parks were participating in that meltdown. And I think this is some of our critical challenges. People that are living next to parks, I think Paul had highlighted it already, there are inadequate law enforcement inside and outside parks. very often the human-lion conflict disincentives just make it not feasible for anybody wanting to be interested in conserving lion. And the biggest problem is the unclear property right associated with our history of the past. So I ask myself, if humans are primarily our challenge, why do we define our problem in terms of lions? Perhaps we should think a little bit and adding to just defining it in terms of a lion problem. For example, I think the way to go is to really think about how do you get coexistence of humans and lions, and this will only realize and unlock the full potential of all potential values that's associated with lions and the sustainability particularly of those things if it fix the social wrongs of the past. And this requires 3 steps. Ensure the fairness of user rights. I think Kirk talked a little bit about that. But ensure also equal accesses to particularly basic needs. I think Colleen highlighted that often we do community projects, but somebody hasn't even got the security of his food being around the next day, and you're trying to bring him up to an educational level. And then if you are clever enough, and you can do that things that I've just said to you in a way that creates opportunities for employment and entrepreneurship to emerge, particularly if they associate with lions. And then you might have some new outcomes that matters for people. I want to give you an example. Some time ago, I was there with Paul in the Caprivi, and dealing with human-lion conflict might actually be a socio-economic development. It may be a business opportunity for somebody that provides protection and actually gets paid in terms of a barter scheme rather than a financial scheme, rather than us worrying about it as a human constraint and then think about how we're going to get funding from very far to try and deal with that. And I think Joseph highlighted very nicely the potential opportunities to use traditional knowledge. I think the saving of people might actually be a key element in saving lions. And importantly, this may make lions important for governments, not necessarily just for some of us that love lions for the sake of lions. So David, I think one of the challenges we may have to perhaps to rethink or complement our problem definition, and perhaps the greatest challenge for the summit is to ask one of 2 questions. So, do we continue with our fortress mindsets even in our landscape thinking and remain conservation elitists? And this even includes some of the ideas that we have about ecotourism, and then hope that we will get funding every year from a particular outside source. Or alternatively, do we embrace local people and maximize all opportunities associated with the lion? This is way more than just the fairness between communities and conservation. This is all about getting people down to basic needs that they need to have. And I think, in my mind, if we do the latter, I think we may have a watershed movement that has way more bigger impacts than the Sissel moment or the Sissel movement imagined. It's really impacts for people and for lions alike. Thanks, Dave.
Sam, thank you so much. You hear the warmth of the applause. We're going to bid you farewell now. Thank you for organizing your day around this. We've got about another 10 minutes of this meeting before we move an hour later to the public meeting at the Blavatnik School. I hope you'll be following us there. But for the time being, Sam, thank you very much, and bye-bye for now.
Take care, guys, and enjoy the discussions.
Good. So what I suggest we do now, we have about 10 minutes left, is actually return to each of the 5 people on the panel, asking whether in the course of just a couple of minutes, they would like to make any reflections on the discussions we've had and the new blood, as it were, that's come into the discussion, both by Skype and in the room. And I have in mind, Craig, turning to you first, also the recurrent question of whether wildlife can or should be expected to pay for itself.
Thank you, David. I think that the notion has always been that wildlife would pay its own way because there was this profound love for African wildlife amongst wealthy foreigners who would come to the country and either view it through a camera or shoot it. And I don't think there's enough money that's generated that way to cover the cost. From what we've seen of the operating budgets of parks all over Africa, almost no parks generate enough money to truly protect their wildlife resources. It's far more expensive than anyone imagined. The market is not, it can't bear very, very expensive park fees. It cannot bear very, very expensive hunting fees. So there is still internationally a tremendous love for lions, even for people who've never been there. And so maybe one of the things we're thinking about is that the money that will be required to do those things that both Sam and Colleen have been talking about, which are so desperate and urgently needed, can come from our love for wildlife, our love for lions. And what we need to do is explore a willingness to pay. And I just wanted to give an example, because I'm from the state of Minnesota, and here in Europe you don't hear much about it because it's a flyover state. It's in the middle, at the top of the US. But we're famous for our wildlife. We have 10,000 lakes. That's a rare example of American understatement. We have closer to 14,000 lakes. We have loons. For a long time, we were the only state in the lower 48 that had wolves. And so our state has done several things, and you have as an option, when you pay your taxes, to donate $1, $5 to the non-wildlife, the non-game fund. This is not for the deer herds that hunters like to go and shoot. It's for pheasants and grouse, whatever else. And every year, the state of Minnesota gets from its taxpayers voluntarily about $1 million. And that's just one state, and we're not a very big state. Also, despite the incredible resistance of one of our major political parties in the US against any form of taxation, the state of Minnesota had a referendum where they were asked, would we be willing to pay an additional 1% on our sales tax in order to protect our 10,000 lakes? So we actually have a very large fund of money, because even in a year that ran very poorly for our leftist party and ran very well for the more right-wing party, Minnesota voters said, yes, raise our taxes. We will pay an extra 1% in sales tax to protect our lakes. Finally, we're one of many American states that has a lottery. And where does the money from the lottery go? It actually goes to conservation. So in 3 different ways, my state is shown a willingness of the general public to support the environment. And I think the message that we need to get across is that the globe is our environment. It affects us in so many ways to think about the health of African savannas, about wildlife all over the globe. And I think we can ask citizens beyond just Minnesota to contribute, not just through emotional appeals of the moment because it's trendy, because a very famous lion was shot by, a Minnesota dentist, but that we actually do care. And that also, I think it's not a bad message to hear, that we do care about equity, we do care about fairness, we do care about the poorest people on the planet. And as we've heard today, there's a chance that we can act in a way that works towards solutions towards both of those problems simultaneously. Thank you.
So I'm probably going to depart from my grandiose vision for Africa and perhaps talk about what's closer to home. So I live in the Gaza area, which is these 5 amazing countries that have agreed to really try and focus on socioeconomic development through the use of natural resources and the protection of natural resources in a region. And it's a very honest commitment to providing the societal needs in the region and using wildlife and other natural resources in the system to achieve it. But what is really interesting is that each country does it in a slightly different way and have slightly different outcomes. And I suppose what I want to speak about there is the fairness. So only one of the 4 countries has really agreed to the full devolution of user rights. And not only done that, but put the mechanisms in place such that when people are allowed to access the resources, that they do this in a controlled way, just as one would do in North America. In North America, you can hunt deer and ducks and whatever, but you don't just do it at your will and you do it at your pleasure, but you do it under some form of control. And so in Namibia, they have really succeeded in putting this kind of situation into place. I've only lived in that area of the world for 3 years. And every single year, as I go out into the protected areas to drive around and look for wildlife, I see more and more wildlife. It just, and my visual observations are backed up by the data that's being collected in the area. We see lion populations recovering. We see lions have found protected areas there in the last 5 years where there were no lions before. And to me, this has to be an example that we can take to other systems where being fair and putting controls in place, that we have succeeded in a little small part of the world in achieving a reversal of what we are talking about here today. And long may it last, and hopefully other countries where there are tighter controls and tighter restrictions on how communities are allowed to access these resources, maybe these lessons can be learned and taken elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be very brief, but let me start with a story from one of our former students. We had a PhD student a few years back at the University of Botswana. He was studying fires in the Delta. What are the causes of fires and the like? And as he was defending his proposal, there was a suggestion that maybe he should look at the human contribution to the fires. And in his response, he simply said, there's no way in which he can look at the human aspect, simply because he's being asked to look at perceptions, and perceptions are not science. Therefore, to him, what humans were doing could not contribute to the fires. I was in that panel, and I know very well, I've studied tourism in the Delta, and I know very well that some of the fires are caused by hunters, some are caused by tour operators, and the like, and there was need really to look at that aspect. What I'm trying to say here is that when we study lions, we should not only focus on one aspect. We should look at all what is there to be looked at. What is there in terms of social science research, and what is there in terms of natural science research. And then if we have information from both sides, we will be in a position really to maybe move forward in as far as lion conservation is concerned. Secondly, when you speak of conserving lions, we need to define the benefits of lions to people who live in those areas. If we fail to define benefits, what are the benefits from conserving lions to them, then we have a rough road. What are the benefits? What are the benefits of conserving lions? What is it that they're getting? We in academia, we know the benefits, but do the benefits that we have similar to those that communities have? Some of the communities see lions as this dangerous animal, which is always predating on their livestock. So we need to integrate all this and try and make it clear to them what really means in as far as lion conservation is concerned. He just gave a good example of Namibia, where people have rights over land, rights over resources. That is a very good example. The question is that the same case in most countries? And the answer is no. In some of the countries, you'll find that resources like wildlife are a national resource. Land is a national resource, cannot be given to a community or to a private individual. So we are now faced with the challenge of how do we deal with this kind of a situation, where people don't own resources, don't own land, don't own lions, somebody else is owning that. The tendency to not feeling obliged to conserve is very high. So this is one of the challenges that we need to look at. But one good example that he gave was the recovery of lion populations in Namibia. Another good example is the rhino population in the Okavango. When I started working in the Okavango some 20 years ago, the rhino population was zero. It was zero. And much of it was because of poaching and the like. But as I speak to you right now, there's a population of close to between 200 and 300 rhino population in the Okavango. And you'll find that most of this rhino population is in certain concession areas or pieces of land. And this actually took an integrated approach where the business community, the scientists, the local people were brought together to discuss the rhino situation. And I think we can learn from there and pick it from there and bring all stakeholders together and discuss the way forward. Some people are just giving money, to bring in some rhino populations from South Africa into Botswana. We can bring money from Donald Trump and the rest of the rich colleagues somewhere to do something about conservation in Africa. So what I'm saying is there are some individuals, there are some big corporations which are willing to contribute to conservation. And the message that we bring to them, how we convince them to be part and parcel of the game is left to us. Lastly, what I want you to really realize is that when we speak of protected areas in Africa, fine, some of them, no human beings. But when we speak of other areas, wildlife areas, there are communities who live in those areas. And we need to look at that, and we need to deal with the issue of livelihoods and conservation together. We shouldn't separate them. A hungry man is very dangerous to the environment. He will kill. When given the opportunity, he will kill whatever comes to him in order to feed his family. So the people who live in some of these protected areas, and we need to take into consideration their well-being, their livelihoods, and once we deal with those aspects, then we'll achieve conservation. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. We must ask Kirk and Achim to be quite crisp.
Wildlife has to pay its way. It sounds like something an economist would say. Probably has been said by economists. I'm convinced that we haven't really tapped what we would call willingness to pay. I talked a bit about it's a global public good. There is a global audience who values lions. Part of what we've talked about in the workshop is different ways that we can try to tap that, and that's really worth pursuing. I'm not convinced that we've tapped the tourist sufficiently. The studies in the tourism literature, it's quite convincing. It says, especially for the higher end sorts of activities that tourists do, are not very price sensitive. You can raise a bed night fee, if you like, quite a bit, and have a very small impact on the number of tourist dollars spent in the country. We need to test that idea in an African context, in a safari context. But I'm convinced that the 3 to 6% I talked about as the contribution of nature tourists is really just they pay for the lodging, the food, the activities that requires inputs, wages are paid, etc. It's not really counting the fact that beyond the park fee, which is the only fee they're paying directly for conservation, there's more we could take out of their pocket. They're flying away with this tremendous feeling of having experienced wildlife, and they are willing to pay more. So in some sense, wildlife has to pay its way, but we've come nowhere near tapping the sources of payment.
David, I know you need to get us out of here, so very briefly, because somebody also asked, what are we trying to achieve? I think there's one objective that everybody would most likely agree on, which is stop the decline and begin to build the opportunities for lion populations to recover. Many pathways. I think just listening to the last few examples here, quite clearly there is not one, but there are many pathways. None of them can succeed without addressing local reality. I think this is another theme that I would draw out here, none of them. And all of them will depend on a rationale of investing over competing needs and land uses. And I think there is philanthropic potential, there is public funding and investment, and there is commercial investment. All three need to be sought, including through the tourism industry, but also the philanthropy. And people donate over $500 million to the WWF family every year. TNC has $900 million income every year. People are willing to invest. But if you look at the scale of investment, we need all these resources, and they need to be used for different purposes. The philanthropic funding, I think, is a kind of emergency funding, a catalytic funding, a kind of turnaround funding. But at the end of the day, it is also African nations and economies, it is the development institutions that need to co-invest, and ultimately there can be an element also where commercial private investment has a profit in co-investing with the community and maybe national authorities. So just to say also thank you for bringing this wonderful summit here to the Oxford Martin School. It's been a privilege to host you here. Thank you.
Okay. The reason there's shuffling in the room is that the speakers for tonight need to be mic'd up in the Blavatnik School. There's 10 people who know they must leave swiftly to get to the taxis parked downstairs. In the meantime, let me thank you all. This is just a pause for breath before we make our way to the next and final session. You might be surprised that after 2.5 days of doing so ceaselessly, scarcely stopping to sleep, breathe, or eat, that we could still speak enthusiastically and, more importantly, usefully about lion conservation. But we've shown it's possible. Please thank everybody who's contributed, and particularly our panel. The 10 people who need microphones have to run to the taxi downstairs.
You had an urgent question.